Who here knows how many people were killed as a result of the destructive, illegal, genocidal US war of Iraq? Who here knows? Raise your hand. Give us some estimations in the chat, which people who watch this in the clip won't be able to see. Someone said 1 million, 2 million, 2 million, 1 million. Well, it's a lot more than 1 million. Easily a lot more than 1 million. Because that 1 million figure, that actually came out just a few years after the war started. And obviously a lot more shit has happened as a result of the war and the continued American occupation after that since. Because when you start an illegal genocidal war of aggression against another country on the other side of the world, you're responsible for everything that comes afterwards. You're responsible for all of it. The US was responsible not just for the people they literally murdered with their own weapons, which there were a lot of, by the way. They were also responsible for all of the instability, all of the collapse in infrastructure, the collapse in things like medical facilities, the collapse in networks of like food trade that would cause people to starve, etc. You know, the destruction of Iraq's infrastructure, which, by the way, they intentionally targeted things like electricity plants to be destroyed during the war, which obviously killed people and would continue to kill people afterwards. Just like a massive cascade of effects leading to things like the creation of ISIS, by the way, which again, America's fault. And then you also have to add on to that as well, the people, for example, who maybe didn't particularly die, but whose lives were ruined. Like, how to even quantify that? So it's a lot more nuanced than just a figure and just tossing out a big number. And the effects of the Iraq war continued far beyond most of the studies that are still cited today, because most of those studies were released like 2010 at the latest or earlier. And obviously we're 13 years in the future on from then now. So this is a study from 2018 here that we're going to be going over. And this study estimates 2.4 million deaths. So it goes over some of the earlier studies, such as there was a study by the Lancet, which is massively, by the way, the US government, the UK government, and their useful idiots in academia, in the newspapers, etc., in the media, they attacked this study. They estimated 600,000. They were then like, there was a massive propaganda campaign to delegitimize this study. And that was just in the first 40 months of the war, by the way. 600,000 Iraqis killed violently as a result of the US invasion and occupation. People who wouldn't have been killed if it didn't happen. Along with 54,000 non-violent but still war-related deaths. Okay. Of course, the US, UK governments, their propagandists tried to attack and discredit this, as some of them still do today. 600,000. Okay, 600,000. The British government at the time, while publicly attacking this study, in private, they said that it was actually close to best practice and robust and tried and tested. In private, they were saying the study was good, while in public, trying to delegitimize it and attack it. That's 600,000 deaths. 600,000 deaths. That is insane in just 40 months. Americans like to justify the Iraq war by pointing to Saddam and saying that Saddam was worse. Estimates on the people that Saddam killed in Iraq, like higher-end estimates during his entire reign, are around 250,000. 250,000. The US beat that in a year. It's unfucking fathomable. And it went on. It went on. So the latest estimate was of these efforts to count the number of deaths in Iraq came from, before this thing here, came from September 2011. And the estimate then was 1.45 million, a lot higher than the commonly cited 1 million figure. That 1 million figure comes from a study that was carried out very soon after the war. I believe it was 4 or 5 years afterwards. It is pretty stellar the way that people try to discount the death toll of the Iraq war, and not even just that, because it caused so much worse ripple effects aside from just literally killing people. How do you quantify people who had their homes destroyed, people who had their lives ruined, people who had any sort of possible opportunity taken from them, all by this destructive war? In just 3 years, they killed more than double the amount of people that Saddam had killed. At least if we don't count his war on Iran, which was supported by the USA, by the way. So, yeah, we can't exactly separate them from that anyway. So they justify it with Saddam was bad, and then they come in, they kill about 10 times as much people as Saddam ever did. And then they have the gall to keep saying that it was because Saddam is bad. When if you look at what they actually did after the war, as I've gone over on this channel before, there was the whole thing that they did that clearly shows why they invaded Iraq, which was not because they thought Saddam was bad. It was because they thought saying that he was bad was a useful justification for getting in there, taking control of the oil fields, giving control of the oil fields to American companies so they can... And by the way, they paid for the contracts to American companies with money from fucking Iraqi state coffers, paying American companies to rebuild the country after they had just intentionally destroyed its infrastructure. That's another great thing that the US loves to do. They did that in the first Iraq war as well. They also did it in both Yugoslavia interventions they did. They just make sure to specifically destroy like power plants, water treatment facilities and shit like that. They really love doing that. In Iraq, the reason why they did it is because they wanted to rebuild them after the war. So what they did is when they were occupying the country, they took the state's gold and they paid American companies to rebuild it. How nice of them. Humanitarian, yay! The Iraq war was just a scheme, as is with all American wars. This is why they do it. It's a scheme to redistribute wealth from the third world to first world corporations. Not just that, but if they can somehow find a way to redistribute like public funds from the first world to corporations as well, they love to do that as well. And that's what they did with buying weapons and shit, paying PMCs and shit. The idea that the only deaths in Iraq that should be blamed on the US invasion are like just the initial deaths, the people who they killed directly, is obviously absurd. Especially because they always try to say that you shouldn't include combat deaths, as if like the people who they were fighting were not in the right to fight against them when they were fucking genocidal invaders. And yes, targeting infrastructure like that is a war crime. In fact, I'd like to show you some articles regarding that, because the Western media has recently, suddenly, been talking about how that's a war crime, but not because of Iraq. They never brought it up for Iraq. They brought it up for Ukraine. Is attacking Ukraine's power grid a war crime? Asked the BBC, the voice of the deep state of the United Kingdom, or just the state of the United Kingdom, of Queen Elizabeth and her disgusting dead corpse. The only reason that they don't give it a definitive answer here is because they mention, basically, if it's a war crime in Ukraine, that would make it a war crime in Iraq and Serbia too. And another thing is that you can't even argue that the US intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure in that case was even remotely necessary for military purposes, even though that wouldn't excuse it, obviously, because they're doing a genocidal war of aggression. Nothing they do is legitimate in that case. There was obviously no need for them to do it. The reason why they did it is because they wanted to... One, they're just depraved. They love to kill people. Two, they wanted to destroy as much as they could because then they could pay American companies to rebuild. They didn't really rebuild, but that was justification. It was just a justification to give a bunch of Iraqi state money to American companies. Oh, and also, I forgot to mention, they also... These 2.4 million people who they killed, they were killed, get this, not just for that, but also so that they could force the Iraqi state while they were occupying it to take out loans from the US government. They literally did that. Like the US, while they occupied Iraq, while they literally directly controlled the Iraqi government, not that what came after it wasn't a puppet or anything, as it obviously was, they used Iraqi state funds, state gold deposits, to pay American companies for things like oil contracts that they, of course, gave to them, rebuilding contracts that they, of course, gave to them. And when the Iraqi state funds couldn't cover it, they made the Iraqi state pay for it with loans from the US government. It was literally a war carried out, 2.4 million people murdered in order to redistribute wealth from the Iraqi people to US corporations. That's why it was done, obviously. And this is why the US does its imperialism. It wants to exploit third world countries to make the money for its corporations and other Western corporations and defend its interests, which is to make money and uphold the global capitalist system which Eddie's at the head of. That's what it's all about. Like, Americans justify this with Saddam bad. Saddam clearly wasn't so bad because they supported him for decades beforehand. They supported him in his awful, murderous invasion of Iran. They supported him as he gassed Iranian troops and civilians. In fact, they gave him intelligence so that he could do so. Let me show you the article. This is Foreign Policy magazine, just a blatant US imperialist magazine. Even they admit this. CIA files prove America helped Saddam as he gassed Iran. In 1988, during the waning days of Iraq's war with Iran, the United States learned through satellite imagery that Iran was about to gain a strategic advantage by exploiting a hole in Iraqi defenses. US intelligence officials conveyed the location of the Iranian troops to Iraq, fully aware that Hussein's military would attack with chemical weapons, including sarin, a lethal nerve agent. Isn't it great to invade Iraq because the guy who you supported for decades, who was the dictator of Iraq, was bad? And then you, in 1 year, kill more people than he killed during the entire time that he was in power. And in 3 years, you kill double that. And in 20 years, you kill 10 times that. Isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful? Can you imagine being the people who believe this shit? Like, who look at everything that happened in Iraq, who look at the utter devastation, the death, the suffering that it caused, by design, by the way. They never gave a shit about any of that. The Iraq War was a massive success for what it was designed to do, which was just to make a bunch of money for American corporations. And it worked. It worked swimmingly. To look at that and try to spin it as like something that was even remotely justified, or even to pay any lip service to the justification that they gave for it, when you can just look at what they actually fucking did. That's like the thing. Like, they're like, well, you know, we had good intentions. No, you didn't. You can look at what you did. The second that you took over Iraq, we can look at what you did to derive what the intentions were. We can look at the looting, and we can obviously say, well, that's obviously why they did it. You know, it's like if you enter someone's house and you murder them, and then you steal a bunch of shit from their house, you can say, well, they murdered them with the intent to steal things. That's why they murdered them. Same thing here. Literally the exact same. The idea that you should pay any lip service to like their justifications for it beforehand is absurd. Obviously, the reason they invaded Iraq is because of what they did. That's kind of how you can derive these things, by looking at what they actually did. It's like there was a Johnny Harris video too. And like that, it was that demonic Johnny Harris intervention video. And he's like, we don't know. Why did we invade Iraq? We don't know. This is the quintessential American liberal obfuscation of very simple, very easy to recognize facts. Because we know why the Iraq War was carried out. We know fully fucking well. We knew beforehand as well. The same reason the US does everything else. And we can also just look at why they did it from using our fucking eyes and brains and looking at what they did once they took power. But here's how Johnny Harris presents it.
Government is extremely low. And the question of how and why we did this expensive, horrific, destructive coup is still something that
He calls it a coup. Jesus Christ, it was a fucking war.
There aren't really good answers to.
Again, there aren't any really good answers to? There aren't really good... Holy fucking shit. Oh my god. Man. Wow. And yeah, the emphasis on like how expensive it was for Americans, it just makes my blood boil, man. Anyway, yeah, I just wanted to talk about the Iraq War again because very, very quickly. Because Jesus Christ, Americans just love to lie. They just love to lie about their genocidal crimes. Like even the ones who pretend to be against the war, they just can't help but lie about it. They're like, I'm against the war, but Saddam was bad and we prevented a genocide. Like, holy fuck, man.